Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? A perplexing crime. It was on a particularly grey and mist-laden morning in October that I, Dr. John Watson, was drawn once more into the enigmatic world of Sherlock Holmes. The fire crackled warmly in our Baker Street lodgings, but the autumn chill pressed insistently against the windows. Holmes sat in his usual chair, his sharp eyes flickering over the morning edition of the Times, his long fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. I had barely settled into my own seat when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, entered with a note in hand, her expression troubled. "A most urgent visitor, gentlemen," she announced. "He refused to give his name, but he insists that Mr. Holmes will want to hear what he has to say." Holmes glanced at me with the faintest glimmer of intrigue before setting aside his newspaper. "Then let us not keep the poor soul in suspense, Mrs. Hudson. Show him in." Moments later, a tall, gaunt man in a dark overcoat and bowler hat stepped into the room. His face, sallow and drawn with worry, was partially obscured by the rising collar of his coat. He removed his hat, revealing a head of dishevelled dark hair streaked with grey. His hands, I noted, trembled slightly as he clasped them together. "You must help me, Mr. Holmes," he said in a low, urgent voice. "A man has been murdered in Whitechapel. An assassination, unlike anything the police have ever seen. And I believe I may be next." Holmes's keen gaze fixed upon our visitor, his expression one of measured curiosity. "An assassination, you say? That is a term not often used so decisively. Pray, sir, who are you, and why do you believe yourself to be the next target?" The man hesitated, as if weighing the cost of his confession, before finally speaking. "My name is Charles Ainsley. The murdered man was my associate, Edmund Carraway. We worked together at the Foreign Office, and he was killed last night under circumstances that defy explanation." Holmes steepled his fingers, leaning forward slightly. "You have my attention, Mr. Ainsley. Please do elaborate." Ainsley took a steadying breath. "Carraway was found dead in his study. No signs of forced entry. The door was locked from the inside. The only wound, a single precise incision at the base of his skull, as if delivered by an unseen hand." He shuddered, and on his desk, written in his own blood, was a single word: Persephone. I do not know what it means, but I fear that whoever killed him will not stop there. I could see the gears turning in Holmes's mind as he absorbed every word. He stood abruptly, his eyes alight with intrigue. "Come, Watson. We must waste no time. Whitechapel awaits, and the game is already afoot." A discussion of peculiarities. As the hansom cab rattled through the damp streets of London, the dense fog hung low over the gaslit avenues, lending an air of ghostly mystery to the city. Holmes sat across from me, his fingers pressed together, in a steeple, his expression one of deep concentration. Mr. Charles Ainsley sat beside me, his gloved hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze flickering anxiously toward Holmes, waiting for the great detective's verdict on his predicament. "You say there were no signs of forced entry?" Holmes asked abruptly, breaking the silence. "None," Ainsley confirmed. "The study was locked from the inside. The windows were bolted shut. Carraway was alone in the room when he was killed. Fascinating, Holmes murmured. A locked-room mystery, then. But tell me, Mr. Ainsley, was the key found on his person? Ainsley hesitated before nodding. Yes, it was in his waistcoat pocket. Holmes let out a soft chuckle. Ah, then the plot thickens. The more impossible a crime appears, the more logical its explanation must be. But let us not draw conclusions prematurely. I leaned forward, and this word, Persephone, written in his own blood. You have no idea what it signifies? Ainsley shook his head. None. I have racked my brain trying to recall if Carraway had any connection to such a name. But it means nothing to me. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim lantern light of the carriage. Persephone, the queen of the underworld in Greek mythology. A curious reference for a dying man to make, wouldn't you say? Ainsley swallowed hard. You believe he was trying to tell us something? Holmes smiled faintly. A man in his final moments often reaches for the most essential truth. Whether it is a clue to his murderer or a reflection of his fate, we shall determine in due time. I turned to Ainsley. You said you worked together at the Foreign Office. What precisely was your line of work? Ainsley hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Carraway and I were involved in confidential matters of international diplomacy. Our work occasionally intersected with intelligence operations, but I cannot imagine why anyone would want him dead. He was a bureaucrat, not a spy. Holmes tapped a finger against his knee. And yet he was murdered with surgical precision in a locked room, and you believe you are next. Clearly, there is more to this than mere bureaucracy. The cab lurched to a stop in front of a stately townhouse in Whitechapel, its windows dark and foreboding. A constable stood at the entrance, his lantern casting eerie shadows against the fog. Holmes adjusted his coat and stepped out briskly. Come, gentlemen, let us see what secrets Mr. Edmund Carraway has left behind. A study of shadows. The air in Whitechapel was thick with the acrid scent of coal smoke and damp earth, the ever-present fog curling around the gas lamps like ghostly fingers. The townhouse of the late Edmund Carraway loomed before us, its dark bricked facade exuding an oppressive silence. The constable at the door, a stout man with a thick moustache, straightened at our approach. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he acknowledged, with a curt nod. "Inspector Lestrade's inside. He'll be pleased to see you." Holmes arched a brow. Lestrade, always one step behind, but ever so determined. Come, Watson. Inside the house was unnervingly quiet. A single gas lamp flickered in the entryway, its dim glow casting long shadows along the corridor. A footman, pale and visibly shaken, stood to the side as we passed. At the far end of the hallway, the study door stood ajar. Holmes entered without hesitation, and I followed, my gaze immediately falling upon the lifeless figure of Edmund Carraway. He was slumped over his mahogany desk, his head resting at an unnatural angle, as though frozen in mid-thought. The room bore no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. A single pool of blood had formed beneath him, its deep crimson stark against the green felt of the desktop. Inspector Lestrade stood near the fireplace, arms crossed. "Nasty business, this," he muttered. "A locked-room case, no doubt about it. Nothing stolen, no forced entry. And that word? He gestured toward the desk. Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze landing on the message scrawled in blood, Persephone. Holmes crouched beside the body, his fingers ghosting over the desk's surface before he lifted one of Carraway's stiff hands, still retaining some rigor mortis. That places time of death at approximately 7 to 9 hours ago. That would be what time exactly, Lestrade? Lestrade checked his pocket watch. That would put it between 10 and midnight last night. Servants found him at first light. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the windows. Locked and bolted, I presume. Lestrade nodded. Aye, just like the door. Had to break it down ourselves. I moved closer, my medical instincts taking over as I examined the wound at the base of Carraway's skull. It was no crude injury, no brute force, no ragged edge. The cut was clean, precise. A single incision, I murmured. This was done by someone with great anatomical knowledge. Holmes glanced at me approvingly. Indeed, Watson, a most curious method of assassination. He straightened, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against his temple. Now, Mr. Ainsley, I must ask, what was Mr. Carraway working on before his untimely demise? Ainsley hesitated, glancing at Lestrade. He had been reviewing diplomatic correspondences, he admitted. Documents of no immediate consequence, as far as I could tell. Holmes gave a knowing smile. Ah, but what you consider of no consequence may be of the utmost importance to another. We must inspect those documents at once. Lestrade gestured toward a stack of neatly arranged papers on the desk. Everything's here. Haven't touched a thing. Holmes leaned over the desk, scanning the documents with a keen eye. For a moment he was still. Then, without a word, he picked up one particular letter, holding it to the light. His expression darkened. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. Instead of answering, Holmes slipped the letter into his coat pocket and turned toward the door. "Come, Watson, there is another stop we must make this evening." Lestrade frowned. "Where do you think you're off to? We've barely started here." Holmes merely smiled. "The key to this mystery does not lie within these four walls, Inspector. If we wish to catch a ghost, we must look where it was last seen." And with that, he swept from the room, leaving us scrambling to follow. Holmes led the way out of Edmund Carraway's townhouse with such urgency that even I, well accustomed to his methods, struggled to keep pace. The night air had turned colder, the Whitechapel fog thickening like a shroud as we hailed a cab. Ainsley, still visibly shaken, hesitated on the threshold. "Where are we going, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. Holmes settled into the carriage and rapped the roof. "To the Diogenes Club," he said simply. Ainsley's expression flickered with unease. "Why there?" Holmes gave him a sidelong glance. "Because, my dear Mr. Ainsley, the dead man's secrets did not die with him, and I suspect someone in that most exclusive of establishments may have the answers we seek." The carriage rattled through the damp streets, its wheels splashing through the filth and puddles of a restless city. I took the opportunity to lean in closer to Holmes. "What did you see in those documents?" I asked. Holmes merely smiled, tapping his fingers against his knee. "Ah, Watson, I do so enjoy when you attempt to keep pace with my deductions. Let me ask you, what do we know so far?" I frowned, reviewing the facts in my mind. Carraway was murdered in his locked study. A single incision at the base of the skull suggests a highly skilled killer. There was no forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The word Persephone was scrawled in his own blood. And now you seem convinced that the Diogenes Club holds the next piece of the puzzle. Holmes nodded. Excellent summary, but you've missed one crucial detail. And that is the letter. His eyes gleamed in the dim lantern light. The one I slipped into my coat. It was not part of the Foreign Office's usual diplomatic correspondences. Ainsley shifted uncomfortably. What was it, then? Holmes reached into his pocket and retrieved the folded sheet of paper. He held it up for just a moment, allowing us a glimpse of its contents. A brief, cryptic message written in a delicate but hurried script. The pomegranate has been split. The shadows move. A chill ran through me. What on earth does that mean? Holmes tucked the letter away again. That, dear Watson, is what we are about to find out. The carriage slowed, then halted in front of a stately, unmarked building. The Diogenes Club, an establishment known for its absolute silence and its exclusive membership of the most brilliant but socially averse minds in London, stood before us, imposing and indifferent. Holmes led the way inside, his usual air of confidence unwavering. A doorman, recognizing him instantly, gave a respectful nod and stepped aside. Who exactly are we here to see? I whispered as we passed through the grand, eerily silent halls. Holmes paused before a door marked Private, then turned to Ainsley. Tell me, Mr. Ainsley, do you recall if Edmund Carraway had any acquaintance with a man named Lord Alistair Blackwood? Ainsley's face paled. Blackwood? You don't mean— I do, Holmes said, and with that he pushed open the door. Inside, seated in a high-backed leather chair, was a tall, silver-haired gentleman with piercing blue eyes. He regarded us with the faintest smirk of amusement. Mr. Holmes, he drawled, setting aside a crystal glass of brandy. To what do I owe the pleasure? Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze never wavering. To murder, Lord Blackwood, and to the secrets that die only when their keepers do. The room fell into silence. Whispers in the dark. Lord Alistair Blackwood regarded Holmes with an expression of mild amusement, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his brandy glass. The lamplight in the Diogenes Club's private chamber cast sharp shadows across his aristocratic features, but his eyes remained cold, calculating. Murder, you say? Blackwood murmured. How very dramatic, Mr. Holmes. Holmes did not sit. Instead, he placed his hands behind his back and regarded the older man with quiet intensity. Edmund Carraway is dead, assassinated, with a single precise incision to the base of the skull, and before he died, he left us a message. One word, scrawled in his own blood. Persephone. For the first time, I saw the faintest flicker of something behind Blackwood's calm facade. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but Holmes, ever the predator of human weakness, had seen it. Ah, Holmes said softly, tilting his head. So you do know something. Blackwood exhaled slowly and took a sip of his brandy before setting the glass down with careful precision. If Carraway is truly dead, then I suppose the pomegranate has indeed been split. Ainsley stiffened. That phrase, it was in the letter on Carraway's desk. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, and that, Lord Blackwood, brings me to my next question. What precisely does it mean?" Blackwood leaned back in his chair. "And if I were to say that I have no idea?" Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. "Then I would be forced to conclude that you are lying." A tense silence filled the room. I found myself gripping my cane tightly, my instincts telling me that we were in the presence of a man who played a dangerous game, one in which a misstep could be fatal. Finally, Blackwood sighed. "Persephone," he murmured, almost to himself. "She who was taken to the underworld, doomed to return each year." He looked up at Holmes. "Carraway and I ran in certain circles, Mr. Holmes. Circles that involved matters beyond the Foreign Office's official records. The phrase you found, 'the pomegranate has been split,' is a warning. It means a secret has been exposed, one that was never meant to see the light of day." Holmes tapped his chin thoughtfully. "And yet, Lord Blackwood, the only secret I see here is the one you refuse to tell." Blackwood gave a slow, calculating smile. "Some secrets, Mr. Holmes, are dangerous even to know." Holmes's eyes gleamed with something between satisfaction and frustration. He stepped forward and placed a single calling card on Blackwood's desk. "My door is always open, Lord Blackwood," he said, "in case your sense of self-preservation ever outweighs your need for secrecy." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the door. Ainsley and I exchanged glances before following quickly behind him. Once we were outside, Ainsley let out a shaky breath. "I don't like this, Holmes. Blackwood knows more than he's letting on." Holmes nodded, staring out at the fog-choked streets. "Oh, he knows far more than he admits. But we now have something we did not before." I frowned. "And what is that?" Holmes's eyes darkened. "Confirmation that Carraway was killed because of a secret. One so valuable that men are willing to murder to keep it buried." The night wind howled through the streets as we stood in silence. And somewhere, in the darkness, I could not help but feel that the real killer was watching. Shadows strike again. The chill of the London night had deepened by the time we stepped outside the Diogenes Club. The gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows along the deserted streets, the ever-present fog curling around us like the fingers of an unseen spectre. Holmes stood motionless on the curb, his sharp eyes lost in thought. Ainsley, still pale from our encounter with Lord Blackwood, turned to Holmes with growing unease. "You believe Carraway's murder was because of this secret?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He produced his pocket watch, glanced at it briefly, then snapped it shut. "Tell me, Mr. Ainsley, did Carraway mention any unease in the days before his death? Any indication that he felt he was being watched?" Ainsley hesitated. "Now that you mention it, he was more withdrawn than usual. He left the office early on more than one occasion. I asked if something was wrong, but he only laughed it off." Holmes nodded. "A man who laughs when faced with danger is either fearless or resigned to his fate." A sudden gust of wind rattled the gas lamps, and Holmes's posture tensed. His gaze flicked up the street. I followed his line of sight, but I saw nothing beyond the swirling mist. "Watson," he murmured, "did you notice that we were being followed?" Ainsley stiffened. I instinctively tightened my grip on my cane. "No. Are you certain?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Quite. Our shadow is a professional, silent, careful, and trained. But even the best make mistakes." He turned sharply on his heel, walking toward a narrow alleyway between two buildings. "Come. I suspect we are about to receive a visitor." Ainsley looked at me in alarm. "Should we not call for the police?" Holmes chuckled. "And what would they do? Chase a ghost? No, Mr. Ainsley. We shall deal with this matter ourselves." We stepped into the alley, the brick walls damp with condensation. Holmes positioned himself in the shadows, and we followed suit. The street remained eerily quiet until the faintest scuff of a boot echoed behind us. Holmes moved like lightning. In one swift motion, he lunged forward, seized an unseen figure by the wrist, and wrenched them into the dim gaslight. A muffled curse escaped the man, as Holmes pinned him against the wall. He was dressed in dark clothing, his features obscured by the brim of his hat. His right hand twitched toward his coat, but before he could act, Holmes swiftly disarmed him, sending a gleaming stiletto knife clattering to the cobblestones. Now, Holmes murmured. "A stiletto, a weapon of precision, rather like the one used to dispatch poor Mr. Carroway." The man sneered. "You've no idea what you're interfering with, Holmes." Holmes's smile did not waver. "Then why not enlighten me?" The man remained silent. Holmes studied him for a moment, then reached into the assassin's coat and withdrew a small folded note. With a flick of his wrist, he opened it. I leaned in to see the single line scrawled across the parchment. "He who speaks of the pomegranate will share its fate." Ainsley let out a strangled gasp. I felt my stomach tighten. Holmes, however, merely exhaled in satisfaction. "Ah, now we know why Lord Blackwood was so careful with his words." The assassin's lip curled. "It's too late, Holmes. You've already seen too much." Holmes arched a brow. "And yet, here I stand." "But he—" The man let out a sharp whistle. Before we could react, he twisted violently, using surprising strength to wrench himself free. He spun on his heel and bolted down the alleyway, vanishing into the darkness. Holmes made no move to chase him. Instead, he unfolded the note once more, running a fingertip over the ink as if weighing its significance. "This changes things," he said at last. I swallowed hard. "Holmes, that man was prepared to kill us." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "Which means we are getting very close to something worth killing for." Ainsley looked between us, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then what do we do now?" Holmes tucked the note into his coat and turned toward the street. "Now, Mr. Ainsley, we set a trap." And with that, he strode off into the night, leaving us scrambling to keep up. The trap is set. The damp London streets stretched before us, dark and near deserted, save for the occasional gas lamp flickering through the thick fog. Holmes walked briskly, his coat billowing behind him, his mind clearly working at a furious pace. Ainsley and I struggled to keep up, the weight of our encounter with the assassin still pressing heavily upon us. Finally, I could hold my silence no longer. "Holmes, do you truly believe we can outmaneuver an assassin's network with nothing but guesswork?" "C'est-à-dire," Holmes smirked, though his eyes remained sharp. "My dear Watson, we are not guessing. We are inviting them to make a mistake, and I intend to ensure that they do." Ainsley shuddered. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Holmes came to a halt beneath a street lamp, reaching into his coat and withdrawing the assassin's note. He held it up to the light, his keen eyes scanning its contents once more. "The men behind Carraway's murder wish to remain in the shadows," he mused. "That means they rely on silence, misdirection, and fear. But the moment they believe their secret is truly at risk, they will act rashly, and that is when we shall unmask them." I frowned. "And what bait do you intend to use?" Holmes tucked the note away and gave me an unreadable smile. "Why, myself, of course." A most dangerous gambit. By the time we arrived at 221B Baker Street, Holmes had already devised a plan that was, as always, brilliant in its simplicity, yet terrifying in its execution. He turned to Ainsley. "I need you to do exactly as I say. No improvisations, no second-guessing." Ainsley nodded, though I could see the nervous tension in his frame. "What do you need me to do?" Holmes moved swiftly, retrieving a sheet of paper and a pen. He scribbled a note with decisive strokes, then handed it to Ainsley. "Take this to Scotland Yard. Hand it directly to Inspector Lestrade, no one else." Ainsley took the paper, glancing at the contents. His eyes widened. "You're announcing that you've uncovered Carraway's secret?" Holmes nodded. "We must give our adversaries the illusion that I hold the final piece of their puzzle. They must believe that I intend to expose them." Ainsley swallowed hard. "And then what?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Then they will come, for me." Ainsley hesitated. "And what if they succeed?" Holmes smiled faintly. "They won't." With visible reluctance, Ainsley nodded and hurried from the room. I turned to Holmes. "And what of me? I presume you mean for me to play my part as well?" Holmes chuckled. "Indeed, Watson. You are to act as you always do, concerned, cautious, and loyal. It will not take long for the assassin's masters to learn of our declaration, and when they do, they will attempt to silence me before I can speak further. He crossed to the fireplace, adjusting the poker absently. "And when they strike, we shall be ready." I watched him carefully, sensing that there was more to this plan than he was revealing. "Holmes, you are taking a great risk." He turned, his sharp eyes meeting mine. "Risk, my dear Watson, is the foundation of every great revelation." The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each second marking the countdown to whatever lay ahead. I exhaled slowly, gripping my revolver. The trap was set. Now, all we had to do was wait for the enemy to spring it. The web of deception unravelled. The night passed in tense silence. Holmes sat in his armchair, fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on the dying embers of the fire. I had seen him like this before, his mind sharpening, dissecting every possibility, anticipating every move of his unseen adversary. I, on the other hand, could not feign his composure. I remained by the window, revolver in hand, peering into the fog-drenched street below. Every shifting shadow, every flicker of the gas lamps sent my pulse quickening. Somewhere in the darkness, a predator lurked. Then, at precisely 2 minutes past midnight, the trap was sprung. A soft click echoed through the silence. The faintest sound of metal against wood. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light. They are here. Before I could react, the door to our sitting room burst open. A masked figure clad in black moved with deadly precision, a gleaming stiletto knife in hand. He lunged for Holmes, but my friend was already in motion. With astonishing speed, Holmes sidestepped the attack and brought his elbow down on the assailant's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. The assassin pivoted, attempting to flee. But the door at the far end of the hall slammed shut. Ainsley emerged from the shadows, a revolver in his trembling hands. Behind him, Inspector Lestrade and 2 Scotland Yard constables stormed in, their weapons drawn. "It's over!" Lestrade barked. "Drop your weapon!" The assassin hesitated, his eyes darting between Holmes and the barrel of Lestrade's revolver. For a moment I thought he would make another attempt at escape, but then slowly he raised his hands in surrender. Holmes bent down, retrieving the fallen stiletto. He examined it with a knowing smile before turning his gaze to the captured man. "A curious weapon of choice," he mused. "Precision kills, not the mark of a common street thug." Lestrade stepped forward. "Who is he, Holmes?" Holmes pulled back the assassin's mask. The gaslight revealed a sharp-featured man with piercing grey eyes and an expression of cold defiance. I gasped. "It's the same man from the alleyway." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, and now I believe it is time we learned who sent him." The man sneered. "You think I'll talk?" Holmes chuckled. "Oh, my dear fellow, you already have." He turned to Lestrade. "Take him to Scotland Yard. Keep him under close. Watch, this man is but a pawn in a far greater game." Lestrade nodded to his constables. They seized the assassin and dragged him away. As the door closed behind them, Ainsley exhaled sharply. "Holmes, do you know who is behind this?" Holmes smiled faintly, stepping to the desk. He picked up a single sheet of paper. Ainsley's letter, the bait that had lured the assassin into action. With deliberate care, he folded it and placed it inside his coat. "I do," he said simply. I stepped forward. "Then tell us, Holmes, who killed Edmund Carraway?" Holmes turned toward us, his expression unreadable. "Lord Alistair Blackwood." Ainsley paled. "Blackwood? But why?" Holmes tapped his fingers against the desk. "Because Carraway knew the truth. Blackwood and his associates have been orchestrating covert dealings beyond the reach of the Foreign Office. Secret alliances, betrayals, assassinations. Carraway uncovered something so damning that Blackwood had no choice but to silence him." I felt a chill run down my spine. And the assassin? Holmes smiled. "A loose end, one that was meant to be tied up the moment we got too close." Ainsley sank into the nearest chair, his hands trembling. "Then what now?" Holmes turned to the window, staring out at the fog-shrouded city. "Now, my dear Ainsley, we pay Lord Blackwood one final visit." The game was not yet over, but the end was near. Confronting the puppet master, the hansom cab rattled through the damp streets of London, its wheels slicing through the mist that clung to the cobblestones like ghostly tendrils. Holmes sat beside me in silence, his fingers laced together in quiet contemplation. Across from us, Ainsley fidgeted, the gravity of our impending confrontation weighing heavily upon him. "This is madness," Ainsley muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're walking into the lion's den." Holmes arched a brow, but did not turn from the window. "A lion is most dangerous when it believes itself untouchable, Mr. Ainsley. Lord Blackwood has spent years operating in the shadows, eliminating those who might expose him. But he has made one crucial miscalculation." Ainsley swallowed. "And what is that?" Holmes finally turned to face him, a glint of satisfaction in his sharp eyes. "He does not yet realize that he is the one trapped." The cab came to a halt outside Blackwood Manor, its towering facade looming over us like an ominous sentinel. A steady rain had begun to fall, the droplets tapping against the pavement in a rhythmic cadence. As we ascended the grand staircase, the butler admitted us with little more than a curt nod. Holmes had anticipated this. Blackwood, despite his cunning, had not yet realized the noose tightening around his neck. We were shown into the drawing-room, where Lord Blackwood stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of brandy. His aristocratic features betrayed no surprise at our arrival. If anything, he seemed almost amused. "Mr. Holmes," he drawled, turning slightly, "Dr. Watson and Mr. Ainsley, looking positively pale, do have a drink. You look as though you might faint." Holmes stepped forward, ignoring the offered hospitality. "We found your assassin, Lord Blackwood." Blackwood exhaled a slow, measured breath. "Oh dear," he mused, swirling his brandy once more. "Assassins in London? How terribly uncivilized." Holmes tilted his head slightly. Carraway's death was no accident. He was silenced, just as I suspect many others have been before him. But unlike the others, Carraway left a trail, one that led directly to you. Blackwood chuckled, shaking his head. "You're quite the dramatist, Holmes. You speak as though you have proof." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the folded note, the cryptic warning carried by the assassin. He held it up for Blackwood to see. "He who speaks of the pomegranate will share its fate," Holmes recited. "A curious phrase, wouldn't you agree? Particularly when one recalls that Carraway had been corresponding with a diplomat from Constantinople, the very region where the symbol of the pomegranate is synonymous with secrets and betrayal." Blackwood's expression did not waver. "Fascinating," he murmured. "And yet all you have is a vague riddle, and a captured assassin who, I suspect, has been trained not to talk." Holmes smiled. "Yes, it would seem so, wouldn't it? But the devil is in the details, Lord Blackwood. You see, our silent friend carried more than just this note. He also carried a watch, a rather fine piece, engraved with the crest of your family. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something cross Blackwood's features." Holmes continued, his voice laced with satisfaction. "A man like you does not soil his own hands with murder. You delegate, you instruct. But mistakes are inevitable, and even among the most skilled of your agents. And this time, your reach exceeded your grasp." Blackwood exhaled, setting down his glass with deliberate care. "Let us assume, for the sake of amusement, that I was involved in Carraway's demise." He turned to face Holmes fully, his gaze cold. "What do you propose to do about it?" Holmes smiled. "Why, nothing at all." Ainsley and I both stiffened. Blackwood narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "I simply thought it fair to inform you that Inspector Lestrade has taken a personal interest in your affairs. Even as we speak, the assassin is being interrogated at Scotland Yard. Should he choose to speak, I dare say your social calendar will become rather occupied." Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "And if he does not speak?" Holmes shrugged. "Then I shall find another way to ensure justice is served. You see, Lord Blackwood, men like you operate under the illusion of control. But control is a fragile thing, and fear is an unpredictable mistress. I suspect your allies will not look kindly upon failure. And with Carraway's demise now in the hands of Scotland Yard, your position is precarious indeed." A heavy silence fell between them. Blackwood stared at Holmes for a long moment, before exhaling through his nose. A slow, measured breath. Then, to my astonishment, he smiled. "Well played," he murmured. "A shame, really. I do enjoy a worthy opponent." Holmes tipped his hat. "As do I, though I imagine we shall not meet again under such civil circumstances." Blackwood's smile did not fade, but something in his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. He knew he was cornered. Without another word, Holmes turned on his heel and strode toward the door. I followed, my mind still reeling from the exchange. Ainsley hesitated for only a moment before hurrying after us. As we stepped back into the rain, Ainsley exhaled sharply. "That's it? He walks free?" Holmes did not slow his pace, for now. Ainsley clenched his fists. Then what was the point of all this? Holmes stopped, turning to face him. "The point, Mr. Ainsley, is that men like Blackwood do not require immediate punishment. They require certainty that their empire is crumbling. And tonight we have planted that seed." Ainsley seemed unconvinced, but he said nothing more. I, however, could not shake a lingering thought. "Holmes, do you truly believe Blackwood will face justice?" Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile as he turned back toward Baker Street. "Oh, my dear Watson," he murmured, "justice has already begun its work. We need only wait." And with that, he vanished into the mist, leaving only the echoes of his certainty behind. The last move in the game, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth of 250 Baker Street, casting flickering shadows along the walls. The rain had ceased, leaving the city streets damp and glistening beneath the gaslights. The night's events still swirled in my mind, but Holmes, as ever, seemed utterly untroubled. He sat in his armchair, long legs stretched out, his fingers pressed together in thought. His gaze, half-lidded, was fixed on the ceiling, as though he were listening to some distant symphony only he could hear. I set down my empty glass of brandy and exhaled. "Holmes, do you truly believe Blackwood will not retaliate?" He gave a small, knowing smile. "Retaliation requires certainty, Watson. Blackwood may suspect that I played him tonight, but suspicion alone is insufficient. If he acts rashly, he risks exposing his entire operation. No, he will retreat into the shadows, where men like him always lurk, watching, waiting. But make no mistake, his days of unchallenged power are numbered." I frowned. "And yet he still walks free." Holmes tapped a finger against his temple. For now, yes. But consider this. The true power of deduction does not always lie in the immediate resolution of a case. Sometimes the greatest victory is forcing the opponent into a position where his own missteps will destroy him. I shook my head, smiling despite myself. You treat the world like a chessboard, Holmes. He chuckled. Perhaps, but it is a game I play rather well. Wouldn't you agree? Before I could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed shortly after. A letter for you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes sat forward with interest as she entered, handing him a sealed envelope. The seal was unmarked, the paper thick and fine. I watched as he slit it open with his penknife and scanned the contents. A slow smile curved his lips. Ah, how delightfully predictable. I leaned closer. What does it say? He handed me the letter without a word. I unfolded it and read, Mr. Holmes, a most impressive display. However, I suspect you know this game is far from over. London is a large city, but not large enough for both of us. Let us see which of us remains standing when the pieces have all fallen. A friend. A chill ran down my spine. Blackwood. Holmes shook his head, his smile deepening. No, this is from someone else. Someone who watched tonight's events unfold with great interest. I set the letter down carefully. And what do you propose to do about it? Holmes stretched his arms lazily before rising to his feet. Nothing at all. Not tonight. He moved to the window, looking out into the misty streets below. I could see the gleam of excitement in his eyes, the anticipation of a new challenge. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I do hope you'll get some rest, Holmes. Even you must tire of the endless intrigue. He chuckled, clasping his hands behind his back. My dear Watson, the intrigue never ends, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The clock struck midnight and the game, as always, continued.